Hello, and welcome to Unexpected Insights with the Stanley Museum of Art. My name is Jennifer Miller, and I'm a doctoral student in the College of Education here at the University of Iowa, and I'm also a graduate research assistant with the Stanley. For this episode, we'll be looking at American artist Judy Pfaff's work on paper, titled Hand in Hand, created in 1996. Like many of you in the viewing audience, we only have access to the digital image of this print. However, that doesn't stop us from sharing what we see in the image. Guest presenters this week come from the University of Iowa Center for the Book. Pranav Prakash will talk to us about what he sees in the script. Sarah Parr will share with us her insights about printmaking, and Nicholas Cladis will talk to us about papermaking. For your reference, here's a video index showing the 4 parts, coordinating timestamps, and names of each speaker. All right, so we're going to start looking at the layers of this Judy Pfaff print. And it came to my attention last fall in 2020 when I was taking a class with Pranav. Hi, Pranav.
Hello.
So Pranav and I were in a class last fall with Kalmia Strong, and it was a University of Iowa Center for the Book class called Material Analysis. Looking at this piece that's part of the Stanley Museum collection, I was immediately struck by the layers of this piece, and I shared it in the context of a University of Iowa class. Lucky for me, Pranav took what he saw in this and wanted to just run with it. So Pranav is here at the University of Iowa as a Wingate Fellow with the Center for the Book. He's also currently a junior fellow with the Andrew Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, Rare Book School, University of Virginia. I'm going to turn it over to Pranav now, who can share his unexpected insights about this Judy Pfaff print, Hand in Hand. Thanks, Pranav.
Thanks a lot, Jen, for that generous introduction. Yes, I mean, this painting was quite interesting to me because I remember you had done a presentation on ledger painting, and this particular piece by Judy Pfaff was shown in the class. And what struck me really was the background text, which is something you don't see in India today because it's an obsolete script that was used by a specific community, especially the mercantile and trading community, the community of merchants and traders who did business in Western India, largely in areas corresponding to the contemporary state of Rajasthan or Punjab. And this script, because it was used by merchants, it was often used in account books, in writing statements of balances, and sometimes even writing promissory notes, almost like a check that we use today. Mm-hmm. And what struck me was, one, I became interested in knowing how did this particular piece of paper with that handwriting in the background was accessed or came in the hands of Judy, and why was she doing all this on the top of it? I mean, this is a script that is no more really used in contemporary India. It's an obsolete script, as I mentioned. But this piece of writing clearly belongs to a community of merchants or traders who would have lived in 19th or late 18th, early 19th century, or even 20th century. I mean, they continued to use this script until the mid of 20th century. And after that, there was some kind of standardization of Rajasthani languages in which Devanagari, which was the dominant script used for languages like Hindi, became the primary script with which Rajasthani languages were being written. Mm-hmm. And so this particular script, which is called Mahajani script, Mahajan literally means a trader. Mm-hmm. And Mahajani is that which belongs to a trading community. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it was also referred to as Sarafi. Saraf is a Persian word, which basically means someone who deals with currency, or someone who does money exchange, or someone who does business of that sort. And so this is also at times referred to as Sarafi. Um, and that script was quite prominent in pre-colonial and in colonial times. We don't exactly know the origin of this language, when the origin of the script, when exactly did this come into being, but it has been in existence for several centuries. But in the mid of 20th century, because of the print culture, because of the standardization of languages, that script was replaced by Devanagari. But this is clearly an old uh, writing on a 19th century paper, or maybe early 20th century paper.
Hmm. Would they have would they have originally been in books then? And would the book have been disassembled? Or do you have any speculation of
So
how this paper would have been? Yeah.
that's a very good question. So account books were bound, but sometimes they were simply scrolls. They would be rolled down, or they would be folded and passed on. And because this was a specialized script that was used by tradesmen or merchants, they would um,
Mhm.
they would constantly change hands. So, for instance, you find lists there. You can see already, I mean, in the way it is arranged. So this is the image that you have in the background is placed horizontally. If you make it vertically, that is how the text would be read from top to bottom. So those black triangles that appear on the right hand side,
Mhm.
that would be the top, and the hand-like figure that appears at the bottom, that will be the bottom of the text. So you read from top to bottom and from left to right. And you can already see there are lists, there are numbers, there are names, or items that is placed there,
Mhm.
which means this was written. This was just a record of who these entities are, or who these figures are. Now, I'm not very adept in this language or this script. I recognize the script because I read texts of that period. But an accountant who would have functioned in that area would immediately recognize the symbols and would easily read what is going on there. And if it's a record of things that were sold or things that one owed to someone else, that could function really like a bank check to someone else, and it could easily pass hands.
Okay. So thank you so much. And next we'll go to Sarah, Sarah Parr will speak to us in the next section. And after that, we'll invite Nick Cladis, and then we'll bring all of you together to have a conversation about the insights that you've shared with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pranav. So, having heard a little bit from Pranav, we're now going to move to our next guest. Welcome, Sarah Parr. Welcome.
Hello.
And Sarah's currently an MFA candidate here at the University of Iowa Center for the Book. And she'll tell us a little bit about her background, what brought her to Iowa City, and some insights that she can share from her perspective as a printmaker.
So I'm Sarah Parr. Thanks, Jen. My background is traditional printmaking. I studied at Minneapolis College of Art and Design and received my BFA in print paper book back in 2006, I guess it would be. Seems like forever ago. After kind of learning kind of traditional printmaking techniques, I added letterpress and worked at Minnesota Center for Book Arts, and kind of deepened my love of the book arts in general. And so after kind of working in nonprofit and working for profit, I decided to apply to Iowa's MFA program in book arts. And so now I'm here. This is my first year. So I moved last August. Seems like forever ago, especially with the pandemic. But kind of talking about Judy Pfaff's work, I know this hand-in-hand piece is particularly interesting because it has multiple types of printmaking. There's etching and lithography. So kind of basically etching-wise, technique-wise, technically speaking, there's this, you typically have a metal plate. Typically it's copper, but you can also use zinc. You can also use kind of non-metal sheets, but I think that if this was produced at Crown Point, would have been copper. The copper is drawn into, or you can either incise directly, or you can put a covering, a coating that you draw into, and then you put it in an acid bath, which etches away or eats away at that metal to create a groove. And that groove is where ink goes when you print. So as you're getting ready to print, you're pushing ink into those grooves, and you wipe the surface of the plate clean. You put your paper down, and then as you put the stack of plate and paper through the press is pressing that paper into the grooves and pulling the ink out. So there's a little bit more of a dimensional quality a lot of times with etching, particularly in contrast to lithography, which is a planographic process where you're printing off of a stone or a plate. In stone lithography, or in any lithography, the concept is, water and oil doesn't mix. So you're drawing with kind of an oily pencil or liquid, like there's a tuche that you can use, which is more painterly. And you draw on your stone, and as you're processing, you're creating more of a chemical stencil on the surface of the stone, as opposed to like a physical groove or a physical carving away. So then when you're printing, you're kind of keeping the surface of the stone wet as you're rolling up. The ink sticks where the sticky stuff is. And then you lay your paper down and pass it through the litho press. But you're typically keeping it it's very flat. There's not a lot of dimension when you actually pull your print up. Also process-wise, that's kind of interesting to me is etching. You would normally dampen your paper to get, excuse me, to get the best impression from the plate. With lithography, you don't typically print with a damp sheet because there's so much pressure. It would probably stretch too much in terms of for registration. So it's kind of interesting to think technically, like kind of maybe what came first, what came second. And with Judy Pfaff's particular print, this one is interesting because it's very representational. When I think of Judy Pfaff's work, it's definitely more abstracted, very close, or like kind of closer to her paintings. And so this seems like from 1996. I'm not sure when her first kind of foray into printmaking, but it seems like a really interesting early piece when she's kind of playing with writing, color, and icons and symbols. I will say in my time at Minneapolis College of Art and Design, one of my instructors, Lenore Thomas, she came out of, or she did her master's degree at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they have a tandem, or they have a press that they invite artists to come and make editions, and that's called Tandem Press. And she worked with Tandem, and she ended up working with Judy Pfaff pretty consistently. And the best story that I've heard about working with Judy Pfaff is that she really loves the dimensionality and so of etching and printing, and so she would kind of sneak her plates back into the acid bath to get a deeper etch, which is kind of sneaky and can maybe make things a little bit more difficult for the printer, but it's interesting to kind of think about that and look at her abstracted works and some of the etchings that she's done previously. She's she seems like a kind of a character, but it's really exciting to kind of see some of this like earlier print work, and then, you know, how if you look at her more recent work, it is definitely way more abstracted, kind of like her paintings. But yeah, I think that it's kind of exciting, and I'm curious to see what Nick has to say about paper, because paper is so intimately connected to the printing process, and you can make paper to fit your techniques, but with both the etching and the lithography, I'm curious to see what Nick has to say about kind of how that paper is maybe built or how it works. So.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And it does give me some insights that are impossible just through digital platforms into the dimensionality of something we typically think of as relatively flat. And that is a characteristic I've noticed in prints, and now when the museum opens in 2022, if we can visit and see this print, we'll get a sense of what you're talking about. And thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
And Nick Cladis comes to us from the University of Iowa Center for the Book. He's an interdisciplinary artist and a papermaker. He's living here in Iowa City. His specialization is papermaking, and here at the University of Iowa Center for the Book, he lectures, and he also manages the Oakdale Paper Research Facility. For 6 years, he lived and worked in Japan, in an area with over 1,500 years of papermaking history. And we look forward to hearing your insights to Judy Pfaff's work hand in hand. Thanks, Nick.
Great, thanks, Jen. Okay, I'm just going to jump right into it and say, obviously, I'm going to focus on the paper. And it's, you know, it's really hard not being able to see the physical piece. But with the information that you gave me in the images, I thought this tied in really well to an experience I had before the pandemic, actually right before the pandemic, when I actually went to a papermaking town in India. So I'm going to share my screen. And Jen, if you could enable screen sharing for me, that would be great. So this is the first thing I wanted to show. And this town was called Sanganer. It's in Rajasthan, which is a state in India. And I was staying there for, let's see here, 2.5, 3 weeks, doing an artist residency. And I arrived at this papermaking village and stayed here for a couple of days and was shown around by Danish Hussain, who's the son of one of the last remaining people who make paper in the traditional Indo-Islamic way in this region. And what you see here, and when I look at Judy Pfaff's hand-in-hand piece, you know, in the paper, there are all these kind of little specks of black and brown and the creamy color, and it just absolutely reminds me of hemp. And here you can see a woman kind of scraping the hemp, and you see a lot of it being gathered here. And here it is redding or fermenting, essentially, typically in a lime. You know, hemp is a cellulose fiber. It needs to be broken down to be turned into paper. So it's redded in that alkaline substance, and sometimes for many months. There are kind of 2 types of hemp paper that this paper mill was making. And one of them is a thicker hemp paper that they make year round. And it's done made very much in a similar style to what we would consider Western or European papermaking. But then there's also a traditional Indo-Islamic paper, which is thinner and made on this structure called a chapri. If anyone has seen the Japanese papermaking screens or East Asian papermaking screens, it's similar to that. And when the paper is made in this structure, it's dried on a wall and then burnished heavily with this stone, which is agate stone. And I just thought I'd also kind of show one of the first things I saw in this village, which kind of made me giddy as a paper maker, was just this field of paper. And Danish told me that this is just packing paper, you know, it's handmade packing paper, but just so it's treated as a very cheap disposable substance. But it was so in love with this sight of seeing it drying out in the sun like this. So I'm really excited now to actually share, and I took a photo of the paper here, but I don't know if this will show up well on the video, but I actually have this hemp paper that has been heavily burnished, and this is the thicker hemp paper. And you can see the stone here as well, the agate stone. And so it's worth noting that, you know, I'm not sure what Judy Pfaff's piece is on, but the resemblance between the hand-in-hand substrate and this paper in particular is pretty striking. And I immediately thought of it when I saw the piece, the image of the piece, and, you know, I'd be really excited to get in there and see the real copy someday. I'm gonna take out a sheet of this so you can kind of see the light coming through and everything. Yeah, so very smooth paper, thicker. It has these specs in it, 100% hemp. And then I think, so I'm more interested in the thicker paper when it comes to Judy Pfaff's piece, because I think that that's the, you know, that's what she was working on. But just as a comparison, some of the very traditional thin Indo-Islamic paper we have here too. And now the color is similar, right? The color is similar, but the surface texture and the amount of speckles, specks and dust and things like that in it is different from what I see in Judy Pfaff's piece there. So these are kind of coincidentally, you know, it's just interesting having gone to India right before this pandemic. This was in January 2020, December and January 2020, and just to have this paper and see the print and immediately be reminded of this experience I had going around with Mr. Hussein on his motorbike and seeing paper mills in the area. So that was kind of what drew me in immediately. And when we look at, you know, images like this, and we look at the paper makers in India, you do have to think about paper making as sort of a cross-cultural, you know, craft community discussion that happens over centuries. You know, you can follow the paper trail from China, you know, onward, but there are instances in which technologies from Europe were then incorporated into paper mills in India. There was a big push for handcrafts in India in the second half of the 20th century, and papermaking was one of them. And a lot of those paper mills, you know, they'll have Hollander beaters, cylinder beaters, very similar to the machinery we would use in the West. But this mill in particular, it's still adhering to the traditional Indo-Islamic papermaking style using the chopri. And it's the only mill to continue doing this. And, you know, so this is a part of the paper trail that survives to this day, an integral part of the paper trail. And I think when we're talking about Judy Pfaff's work and the print itself, and the marks and the imagery and everything, and I think you can't ignore the substrate that it's on, and how that creates a communicative environment with art and with printmaking and with image and mark making. And so I wanted to really elaborate on that. Now I will say too, paper mills in India, they also have some novel ways of making paper that using equipment that we might also have in Europe or in the US, but in some different ways. And I have a video actually that I can show of one such way. This is not the traditional Indo-Islamic papermaking method, but it is at the Hussein paper mill, and making a thicker stock sheet. And I just wanted to share with you kind of the devotion and the choreography here. Okay. So in that video, we can recognize some tools like the mold and decal. We can recognize, the mold. Anyway, and it's interesting that they're essentially putting a linen sheet, or what they're using as a felt, on top of the made sheet of paper, and couching that directly onto a post. And then, there are two of them making the sheet together, and they have a system down, a choreography down to make that sheet. And when I was there in India seeing these paper mills, it was a lot of that. It was a lot of recognizable tools, machines and things like that from my study, and some really interesting ways of using them. And a lot of different muscle memory as well. So I thought I would note that as well. So yeah, just I've totally kind of gone down the rabbit hole with just looking at Judy Pfaff's print and looking at the paper it was on. So Jen, I hope that's that's acceptable.
Yeah, we've been looking at the layer of the paper, the handwriting, the script that's written on there, as well as the printmaking. And I do think you're right that it's probably a thicker paper based on what Sarah was saying about how the paper would have to be wet at certain parts of printmaking process. And we appreciate you sharing your insights. So now we're going to move to a group conversation where the three of you can, and I'll be there present as well, and we can just talk about what you heard each other saying, and we'll move to that room next. Thanks, Nick.
It sounds great.
Bye.
Thanks a lot for that really insightful presentation, Professor Cladis, Sarah, and Jen, for coordinating that. Paper is such an important element of this whole art object. Without paper, it wouldn't be possible. And so it makes sense to first ask Professor Cladis, knowing that he has absolutely no access to the original text or original artwork. But still, looking at the size of this whole paper, I mean, your presentation was extremely helpful. I was just wondering about the size of the mold. Is it being torn in different forms, or would it be a really long roll that they produce and they have some specific way of cutting it into smaller pieces? Also, I mean, to add to that as well, I think you also made reference to how 19th century paper is still being sold in Indian markets. And as an as a researcher who visits these archives, I often hear stories about black markets and how a lot of these paper from 18th and 19th century records somehow end up in the market and Western buyers end up buying it. So since you have been there and you have experienced this whole phenomenon in person, it would be really nice if you could talk a little bit about how the size of the paper squares with the method of productions and what kind of paper are still accessible in the market today.
Sure. So in the mills I visited, I did not see rolls of paper being made. Usually those are made on drums. It's a machine-made process. I know that it is happening in that town. It's just not the type of paper making I'm personally interested in. If we look at the size of the print of Judy Pfaff's print, we can see it's 10 by 27 and a fourth inch. And I did measure these samples I brought back with me. And, in the video that you just saw, maybe you couldn't see the paper, so I'll just show it to you here. The paper that I acquired, the hemp paper. And it does fit into this size. And if Judy Pfaff is making a print, presumably she would have torn it. I'm not sure in the 19th century, I would imagine scrolls that were being made were handmade scrolls, and they were being used, as you said, by accountants and things like that. So when you mentioned the script that is written on the paper, blew my mind, and it makes a lot of sense, because there are places in India now that sell paper from the 19th century that has writing on it. And one example is this place called Khadi Papers, and they're like a distributor of papers. So they have Hussein's papers, the paper mill I visited. They actually sell and distribute those papers. And through that, they also distribute 19th century used papers, basically antiques, for lack of a better word, from Rajasthan. So when you were mentioning that specific time, century, and from that exact region, if Judy Pfaff acquired some reams or quantities of this paper, or perhaps an accountant's scroll, and then tore it down to use for this print, and that was a really interesting connection to have with your analysis there, Pranav.
Yeah, thanks a lot for making a reference to the Khadi paper. Khadi actually, for viewers who are not acquainted with the homegrown industry movement in South Asia, it was one of the movements that was led by Mahatma Gandhi as part of a way of helping Indians become self-reliant based on their own practices of craftsmanship or local homemade industries. And so Khadi clothes and Khadi paper were encouraged. But I'm glad that you talked about how Western methods and techniques and instruments were later imported and adapted in order to encourage a lot of local industries. And there are very few pockets today where they actually produce that. And hence the demand for those paper are increasing, and increasingly artists who are more interested in environmental activism, or who are more interested in non-violent anti-colonial practices, they tend to incorporate that. The other interesting facet about this whole painting that emerges immediately is, again, the methods of printing that Sarah was talking about. And I can see there are multiple colors that are used. Then there are lines that are used. Sarah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her choice of colors, and what would it entail for her to do the filling and the line work? How does that work?
So typically with the traditional printmaking, you're printing one color at a time. So each color that you see is a separate plate or a new matrix to print from. Some of my, like in terms of all of the kind of the muted blue that you see, that's probably one plate. The hands and like maybe the triangles that are with the darker tone, and there's another circle, would be another plate. Some of this looks like to me it might just be handwork as well. I mean, like the yellow dot, the turquoise, the darker turquoise dot, like it may be part of the printing plate, but it also may be kind of some handwork. So there might be some stencil kind of pochoir inspired type work, particularly if it was editioned to keep it consistent.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that insight. And I mean, I really should keep on insisting, acknowledging the fact that we don't have access to the actual material. And so a lot of it is just speculative observation with regards to the methods used. In terms of orientation, clearly it's supposed to be viewed the way it is placed in the background of Jen's panel, right, horizontally. As a printer, do we have a sense whether the print artist expected audiences to move from right to left or left to right, or is it just?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like the insight of realizing that the text and then the paper kind of came from a scroll format. I still feel like with the imagery, I feel like you could read the imagery either direction. But to me, I feel like there might be a left to right component just because, although I'm not positive. I can't say for sure. No, I think that there's nothing that really says to me for sure that it's left to right or right to left, except for maybe the little triangles at the top. But
yeah, I mean, the little triangles clearly is looking downwards, and hands being from palm to up. So we know the top part of the horizontal orientation and the bottom part of the whole panel. But again, it seems like it's open, whether you can move from left to right or right to left. Although if you were to look closely, you could perhaps be able to figure out which processes of printing was embedded first and what the artist was thinking in terms of creative process. The other issue that really jumped at me, and Jen could perhaps help us talk more about this issue, was the fact that she's using a lot of these symbols that do not come from Christian or Judaic or West European or American cultural background. And Jen, you have some experience of working in Southeast Asia and South Asia and even African countries. And a lot of these images clearly either belong to Islamic, Hindu, or Buddhist imagery. And I was wondering if you would talk about your experiences of encountering these images. It's a paper that's clearly Indo-Islamic, as Professor Cladis just explained to us. It's a method that's largely Western, as Sarah has just explained how these intaglio processes developed in the West and how it has been used here. And then there are symbols. Written one, which is of course Rajasthani, and the script is called Mahajani. And then you have these religious, palmistry-based astrological symbols. And I'm wondering, Jen, if you could reflect on some of the experiences you had with regards to encountering such images with your own fieldwork.
I lived in Mandalay, which is in Myanmar, Burma, and there were a lot of signs on the street between the house that we lived in and the university where I taught. And astrology was a big part of the culture, and there were a lot of hand-painted signs. Some of them looked quite familiar, quite like this, and I've also seen this kind of imagery. So I thought, oh, that's the symbol of Fatima's hand. And I've heard that the other there's a cat's cradle image off to the side. So cat's cradle is kind of a string game that people play. I don't know if it originated in England or if it's from the US. So there's a lot of hand symbols here that I can't quite read. I feel like I recognize them, but they're not part of the culture. I don't know what they signify, but they're just, they're illegible to me, as is the text. That's the handwritten text. I can tell it's a language. I could tell it was probably a ledger. I can't read it. I don't know what it says. So there's these layerings of things that, then it just becomes an image to me. It's an image that I want to unpack and discover. That's why I decided to use this as a starting point for material analysis because I wanted to find out what was going on with this. How was this a book? How is this a book? Is it a book anymore?
That's a question that the whole center keeps on asking. What is a book, and to what extent can we expand or make the definition of book inclusive of different art practices pertaining to papermaking, pertaining to print. In the case of symbolism as well, I mean, when I looked at it for the first time, I was like, why is anyone using Hindu symbolism? For me, it was Hindu because the 5 fingers often represents the 5 elements that makes human body, 5 elements that constitutes every religious phenomenon. And then you have these points that are there, right? And in the first one, there's this red point, which reminded me of red is anyway an auspicious color for Hindu religious paintings. And this almost looks like a point, a meditative point or a focal point of energy. And then you have planet-like structures, the blue, yellow, turquoise, and vermilion colors. And so I immediately imagined that some kind of astrological reference that is being made through this, through the use of palm. But again, the question still remains: a white woman getting access to Indo-Islamic paper, which is inscribed by a Rajasthani script, which is using European technology. And then it's clearly intended for a Western audience. I mean, she would not have imagined, I suspect, she wouldn't have imagined this to be displayed in one of the villages in Iran or in Central Asia or India. So it's clearly expected to be a museum piece, and that's why it was changing hands. And so that automatically brings in question of multiculturalism, of Orientalism, of white women, white people looking at Asian cultures, Asian objects. And I think Professor Cladis has spent a lot of time in Japan. So he should begin this conversation about how art objects and Western understanding of how to engage with these book artist practices takes note of their own relationship with Asian people.
Yeah, that's unpacking a lot. I think one thing, just drawing from my own experience a bit, is in the papermaking field, is just how it's a job. It's a practical job. It's a hard job. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes a lot of hours. And living in a papermaking village in Japan for the many years that I did, you know, it's hard for me to take this kind of romanticized approach to the processes, because you know, it's a sort of a thankless you know, job sometimes. The papermaker is often an invisible force in art making, you know. And what I'll say is in Japan, in this papermaking village of Echizen, for example, there's a nonprofit arts organization that's linking artists who are using handmade paper, drawing attention to the craftspeople and the people using their paper, linking them together, showing them within the community, in community spaces, in houses. And this full disclosure, I'm a member of the committee of this nonprofit organization. And I think one of our main goals is to keep the paper there and to create the discourse between craftspeople and artists, so that craftspeople are no longer invisible in the art making process. You know, sometimes they want to be, sometimes they don't want, you know, credit for making the paper that art is on or print is on, and that's fine. But for us in this manner, it's taking those objects out of the white cube, you know, out of these spaces that you know, do not lend themselves to be viewed by the community in which they came from. And so that's kind of our goal, is to keep them there and to create that environment so that those people can see this, you know, artwork that's made from paper, and we can have that discussion within the village. So I immediately, what you said kind of just made me think of that you know, relationship between the artist and the paper maker, and then the museum, and how it can be sort of problematic sometimes, you know. And I know, Pranav, you and I have talked about that before. So yeah.
I mean, there's other dimension to it as well, which is, you know, I mean, this is a female artist who is trying to create her, I mean, she, at this point, this was produced in 1996, and she's clearly a seasoned and well-established artist at this point. And in the world of printmaking, Sarah, I want you to also join this conversation, mainly because I'm aware of your immense background in dealing with art organizations, in managing artists in Minnesota. And so, and being a female artist yourself, you would perhaps be able to help us understand the larger context in which female artists from US or other places tend to connect with communities in Japan, in India, in South Asia, and to what extent are we justified in problematizing their relationship on aspects of Orientalism, on aspects of Romanticism, but also, I mean, their own relationship. They're also struggling with a male-oriented, very class-oriented market in the business world here in US and other places. So your thoughts on, you know, how do you view Judy Pfaff's contribution, knowing that these are objects that are coming from a very different cultural environment?
I feel like Judy Pfaff is like an artist. You know, she, I don't know a lot about her background, but what I know about her is that, you know, she kind of just goes in and does it. And her reputation is, you know, kind of hard work, but also a lot of fun. So, you know, I think that's kind of inspiring. You know, in terms of community-based stuff, like I connected through, you know, education, through my undergraduate experience, through the community arts aspect of Minnesota Center for Book Arts. But, you know, that organization really does focus on the art of the book and in traditional processes. And, you know, there is that, with printing in general, there's that spectrum of, you know, fine art, fine press, printmaking, and letterpress printing, all the way to commercial printing. And so sometimes there is a disconnect between those that do the work and those that see the work as well. And, you know, so that does resonate with me. So, you know, thinking about, I do think that working in a professional printmaking studio has a certain level of privilege. But I do think that women are also very actively participating and creating work, but also being the practitioners, being the craftspeople, making that work as well.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder too if the paper might have been brought into the press that you said was started at the University of Wisconsin. It's possible that could have been purchased and brought to the press if Judy Pfaff indeed made this print at the University of Wisconsin Press, where she visited and worked with your former professor. So
yeah, no, I'm not sure where this specific one was made. It's very possible that it came through the press itself. Mm-hmm. You know, it's possible that it was, and the entire thing could also be a facsimile. In terms of, you know, recreating the paper, recreating the text, mm-hmm. All from scratch as well. But yeah, I'm not positive on that.
So thank you. I think that we've given our audience in the YouTube world who watches the Stanley Museum of Art channel a lot of examples of potential points of entry for future research. When we go to art museums, this may or may not be on display, but there are thousands of pieces in the collection at the Stanley Museum of Art that will be accessible. you can look them up digitally and then come and visit and engage in this kind of research, which I think is one of the strengths of the University of Iowa's Stanley Museum of Art. Will be when the museum opens again, there will be a room for education and for researchers to come in and do this kind of in-depth scholarship. So with that in mind, I'm going to close out this session and thank all of you very much for your time and your unexpected insights. This was really delightful.
Thank you
So much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, see you in the real world. Bye.